If we could ask Chris and Carsten to come up onto the stage, please, that would be easiest. And we now have a series of 20 minutes for some question and answers. So if anyone has any questions from these presentations, raise your hand and we'll get the microphone out to you.
What do you think of the idea that was largely distributed, that in preparation of great events, it would be good to constantly change the altitude where you behave? That means being 1 hour at 2,500 meters, coming down and going back up. That was classically done in the preparation, for instance, of Mexico 86.
You want to comment on that? I don't think there's any scientific studies that have looked at this, as far as I know.
I'd agree. I mean, it's the classic way of acclimatizing, going climb a mountain, but for 2,500 meters, you can probably go straight to 2.5 and stay there. Yeah.
More questions? I'll come to.
Excuse me. As a field doctor, I want to know what preparation do I need to make before altitude training or fighting? And the second question, who will respond to altitude training? And how can altitude training provides an environment to develop and increase tolerance to pain? And the fourth question is, will altitude training always result to improve performance?
I can address the first one. Maybe you can.
Maybe you can.
Okay.
Can you please repeat the question?
Yeah, the first question is what preparation.
In order to predict who will gain from doing live high, train low, I think right now there's no way to predict who will gain by engaging into live high, train low. And I think this is something that should be looked into, which is why we will do it this summer.
Yeah. I repeat just the first question.
Add a little bit. Zon? Yes.
Or this one?
I could lean into that. Just lean into this, that'll work. I think there are certain factors to maybe look at in terms of if you're wanting to try and get a benefit. You know, if someone's training very, very hard and putting big miles in, you know, and they may be a little bit flat, it's probably not a good time. If they've got an injury, it's not a good time. If they're sick, it's not a good time. If they're not iron replete, it's not a good time. So there are certainly factors that we know can reduce adaptability, but to predict who it is, we still don't know. Now that's one. We've got 3 to go.
The second question, if you repeat it, then.
No, I think one question was whether live high, train low would increase performance in all subjects, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say no, it does not.
And I would agree.
Yeah, easy.
But it will in some.
It may.
May.
Celeste.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. You alluded to the fact that there seems to be a difference between hypobaric hypoxia and normobaric hypoxia. Do you have any comments about how that may affect certain adaptations, say, for example, cerebral blood flow?
So I know there are very few studies that have compared normobaric hypoxia with hypobaric hypoxia directly. But one of the changes, or one of the difference, is ventilatory pattern that have been described. Of course, if you have a different ventilatory pattern, let's say it's increased in one versus the other, you will have your increased saturation, for instance, you will have different base excesses, and so on and so on. If you change your base excess, I guess cerebral blood flow could be different. I personally do not think that the effects are huge. But Grégoire should know more about this, I think.
Just to comment, we are currently performing a study where we compare directly normobaric and hypobaric hypoxia at the altitude of 3,500. We don't have all the results, but so far it is clear at the moment with the preliminary results that the performance measure of time trial is more affected in hypobaric hypoxia, slightly. We are measuring cerebral blood flow and brain cerebral oxygenation, but unfortunately we don't have the data yet. But it was a question about, is oxygen pressure the only important parameter? So far, as you said, there are some difference in the ventilatory pattern, but it seems that there are also some other differences.
Thank you for your presentations. I would like to have your opinion on a recent study published, I think, from Andrew Jones, the group from Exeter, showing that intermittent hypoxic training did not affect endurance performance, but their data showed a faster PCR resynthesis after high-intensity exercise.
Yeah, that's an interesting paper.
So what is your comment on this published in, I think, General Blood Physiology?
Yeah,
What is your comment?
I really like the study because it used good methods. It used MRI and so on and so on. So I'm pretty sure about the data, I would say. But of course, if you have an increased PCR recovery, that would suggest that you would potentially increase your repeated sprint ability.
Are you aware of any such data? That's also my assumption, although I'm not aware of any more data in the
I think
literature.
that is, to me at least, that's the only study that has shown this. At the practical level, you could ask yourself, how long time do you actually need to completely recover PCR? I mean, are a few seconds here and there, are they of any practical value?
Thank you. Do I have time for one more question?
Two even.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next thing, if I remember well from the data from the literature, it seems that the daily exposure recommended time for this live high train low is above 12 hours. Am I correct? So from both presentations?
Yeah, pretty much, although we have published recently a study with Naya, first author, showing living at 1,200 metres and spending 10 hours per night at 3,000, produced an increase in, so it was 10, got it down to 10.
I assume this has to do with some of the mechanisms like the hypoxia-inducible factor A alpha, stimulation in the EPO, and all this cascade of events. My question is, why there is this threshold? What is going on? What is the time curve for EPO or for HIF? And what might happen in the rest of the day? Is there something else that's happening where we are not at altitude that counteracts the potential positive effect during our stay at altitude or hypoxia? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with a couple of studies, not on EPO kinetics, but I can certainly comment on one with Ben Levine where we put people at 4,500 to 5,000 metres for 3 hours a day for 4 weeks sort of stuff, and we increased EPO by threefold or whatever, but did not increase hemoglobin mass, and we measured it with Evans Blue and with carbon monoxide. So, 3 hours a day, even at an altitude clearly very much increasing EPO was not enough to continue the downstream cascade of actually generating extra hemoglobin. So there's got to be a threshold there somewhere, the dose response. And, we've done a few studies suggesting that, greater than 12 hours a day is probably enough. And 100 hours, if you're getting an adequate dose of 100 hours, can get you theoretically 1%. But Carsten did not measure, clearly well above that sort of threshold. So, there's still debate to be had.
Thank you for two really interesting presentations. It's more of a comment than a question, is that we're very caught up in, so the muscle stuff that you've done, Carsten, was around mitochondria. There's been an enormous amount of work with hemoglobin mass and other things, but we're assuming that even cerebral oxygenation, tissue oxygenation, and all of these things that we've talked about so far today are the factors that are actually involved in fatigue and performance. And there's so much else that we haven't even begun to look at. So I don't think, Carsten, to say that this doesn't work is necessarily the approach when you've measured a couple of things.
Well, I would like just a comment back, because we have, of course, meters on the brain and on the leg, and they show absolutely zero. And I kind of question also the value of the meters on the brain, by the way. I'm not sure it shows much.
Yeah, and I'm agreeing that we're looking at a couple of things in isolation rather than the many other factors which are actually involved in fatigue and performance. So I think that we're scratching the surface of adaptation, and that we shouldn't expect to have a black and white answer at this stage.
No, but I guess a comment would be, I guess the athletes, they don't really fast. They just want to go faster.
Yeah, I agree.
Maybe a question to put it all into perspective. Then, if it doesn't work, why do, I would guess probably 90%
Didn't work either. That doesn't work either.
Well, maybe this one. To put it into a practical perspective, a question to both presenters. If it doesn't really work in high-performance athletes from a scientific base, why do 90% or 95% of the athletes that go to Olympic Games or major competition actually go to altitude training and say that it works?
So if I can ask first, I would say I don't think elite athletes do go to altitude camps. For instance, the Swedish cross-country skiers, they do not engage themselves into live high, train low. They do live high, train high. They feel that works. The Danish Cycling Federation will not get engaged into live high, train low. It's not as clear cut as it's being sold to be, I would say.
That's still altitude training, live high, train high.
I mean, so the Danish Cycling Federation does not want to go back to Prémenon, for instance, to do live high, train low in a normal baric environment. It's too stressful for the athletes, they feel. So I don't think everyone goes.
Just 90%, a large number of endurance athletes. I think most people here would agree that compete at a world level.
If you want to try to book a live high, train low study in Prémenon, you can go there any day of the week.
No, I'm not speaking of Prémenon.
It's empty up here as well.
Yeah, for sure. But if you go to the Alps or something, you know, and they do live high, train low in a natural environment, you go there in summer, you see a large number of runners, of cyclists. You go to St. Moritz, to Livigno, to these places. So Sierra Nevada, I find a little bit of a discrepancy of what you're describing I will actually see in nature. So, or like in.
It's not my experience with the Swedes and the Danes.
Just to comment about that, I think there's no data about the percent of athletes at medalist or not who are going to altitude training. There's no data available. Maybe at the AIS you might have some stats about that, but so far there isn't any data available. That means we cannot answer this question. We don't know if the people who are doing the 400 are going more or less to altitude than the 10K or the marathon or the triathletes. We don't know so far. It's a very simple question, no answer.
So, sorry, I've got a microphone up here. So the critical question to me seems that it's performance that's the ultimate marker of whether this works or not. And if it takes greater than 10 hours a day at extreme expense to try and get a 1% increment in performance, my question is, would that resource be better spent on other methods of performance enhancement?
I mean, nations put a lot of onus on their Olympic and World Championship performances and spend ridiculous amounts of money chasing those medals. Well, reflecting back to Olaf Schumacher's comment, I think many athletes do use altitude, looking for those last fractions of a percent. You know, I've felt as a scientist since working with Charlie Walsh right back in the early days that I've been trying to measure all the empirical stuff, the anecdotal stuff, and I've really scratched the surface to try and actually come up with an answer of does it work, that I can put my hand on my heart as a scientist and prove beyond all doubt.
There's time left for two questions, both here in the front.
Yeah. Well, my question is, first question is, when you do your thing, whether it's 10 hours or 12 hours or 14, do you see over the 2 or 3 weeks, do you see an increase in sympathetic outflow, as you see with permanent chronic hypoxia? So the first question. The second question I have is, what about apneic breathing? Sleep apnea is up there. So, I mean, sleep deprivation has a huge effect. You lose REM sleep up there, or in the tent or wherever you are. So, how might this factor in?
Can I answer the first one? The second one first. In terms of the sleep side of things, we did publish some work, I don't know, 10 years ago. First author, Kinsman. Yep. Looking at sleep disturbance and more arousals and awakenings, very little incidence of sleep apnea at 2,650. And tomorrow, Charlie Sargent and Greg Roach, sitting 2 rows behind you, will present data from 20 soccer boys from La Paz. So I don't want to steal their thunder.
I think yes, that sounds reasonable, but it should be recognized that I don't have a number here, but some athletes at least they sleep in altitude tents at night, and they have the feeling that more is better, so they sleep at 6,000 meters, and there, hell yeah, you will sleep less. And we have measured sympathetic outflows in our live high train load, and it is increased.
Okay, please, one question over there, and then one at the back, and the rest is for during the lunch.
So, just a further question. I understand that at this stage you can't predict who will respond and who will not, and it seems to me like this is the biggest issue at the moment. It's unpredictable in individual athletes. So do you have any sensation of whether this is reproducible in single athletes? In other words, if you can test somebody in advance to see whether they would respond, can you then use the same athlete or can you advise them to go to altitude? The reason I'm asking is with altitude sickness, for example, that's not always predictable. Even in people who've been to altitude before, they can develop it without any reason.
Yeah, we've done stuff that's published and unpublished, trying to predict individual responsiveness, and I think you can get reasonably reproducible, but it's still very, with individuals that you know that responded before and you've demonstrated it and measured their performance in a race. But even then, if you give somebody the same training block, you know, an 8-week training block or whatever this year, and then you reproduce it exactly next year, other things happen in their lives. They're carrying a bit more of an injury. They broke up with their girlfriend. Their mother's ill. The dog died. Like, I'm taking it to the extreme, but it's very hard for an athlete to reproduce the identical training block 1 year to the next year. And to think that altitude, which has a whole lot of other factors going on, can produce an identical response in an athlete is an oversimplification.
Okay, then please a final short question with a short answer.
So,
turns a lot of the question is.
Carsten, I thought your data, I could be getting this wrong, but you showed, because you did a nice, controlled trial with a placebo group, that the placebo group improved as well as the intervention group. So is there a placebo effect in athletes, and has that been manipulated for benefit in performance?
Whether there's a placebo effect in sport, I'm sure there is. So when we only saw an increase in performance over time when we pooled the two groups, so in our studies we did not see a placebo effect. Unfortunately, I would have liked that.
I'll just maybe comment that a coach will take whatever increase he can get by whatever mechanism he can get.
Yeah.
So the question is whether that's been actually formally manipulated in a way. If you tell the athletes they're going to get 10% benefit, do they get a better benefit than if you tell athletes they're going to get a 2% benefit?
I would like to do a study where we lie to the subject.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying, yeah.
In Zurich, we're not allowed to do that.
Okay, I'd like us to thank our two presenters. It's been a stimulating conversation at the end. I'll hand it over.